Thank you for attending. This event is sponsored by the Center for Global Studies, which is a collection of faculty in the College of Humanities, Education, and Social Science. Dr. Kenneth Kincaid is here. He's a member of the advisory board. Dr. Meeta Chowdhury, Dr. Alan Spector, Dr. Amlan Mitra. Am I forgetting anybody, Kenny? Is that it? Dr. Kim Sipes, Dr. Kathy Tobin are all part of the Center for Global Studies. And there is a Global Studies minor. If anybody's interested, you can talk with me or Dr. Kincaid after this event. This event is on the Ukraine, facts and fallacies. And I'm very pleased that we have two guest speakers. The first speaker is Dr. Larry Wilkerson, who is on the screen. Dr. Wilkerson is a distinguished visiting professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. He served in the Marines for more than 30 years. He was special assistant to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he was also assistant to the US Secretary of State, the late-Colin Powell. So he understands the military, he understands public policy, he understands how the government and unfortunately conflicts work. So he's going to speak to us first, and then I will introduce our second speaker. Each speaker is going to speak 12 to 15 minutes, and then there will be time for questions and discussions and more after that. So Dr. Wilkerson, welcome.
Well, thank you, and make sure my mute's off. And thank you for inviting me to the Purdue campus and to this webinar. It's a very timely moment to talk about the things that you just mentioned, principally Ukraine, of course. There is so much media hype from both sides, that is to say Russia and Washington, but mixed in with media hype from Paris and Berlin and London, like I've not seen before, except possibly around the time period when Americans were literally salivating to do something about 9/11, which led us into probably one of the most catastrophic strategic decisions we've ever made in this country, certainly in the post-World War II era, when we invaded Iraq. As Kofi Annan said at the time, it was an illegal war. It most certainly was. And that makes the hypocrisy in Washington today, in my view, at least, quite apparent, because when the New York Times, for example, or even the president says Vladimir Putin crossed a border, a sovereign border without permission, well, so did we. And incidentally, we have been with our RPAs, remotely piloted aircraft called drones by most Americans. My son happens to be one of those pilots in the Air Force. With those, we have crossed the borders of 9 nations that I know of without their express permission. Maybe we had their permission in clandestine ways, but in some cases, I suspect we didn't have their permission at all. We have crossed those borders and then, in fact, kill people within those borders. So the hypocrisy is just knee-deep in Washington. I think it was Voltaire who said, hypocrisy is the homage vice pays to virtue. Well, we have virtue prostrate at our feet in Washington today. That said, leads me into the first point I would make about this particular crisis, and that is it is shared in the blame for it by Washington, and to a lesser extent because Washington still really is the power in NATO by NATO. Putin is, of course, guilty too, and that leads me to my second point. To this point, Putin has been one of the most pragmatic, chess master-like strategists I've observed in my time as a military professional and afterwards. He has always capitalized on Washington's mistakes, whether they were in Syria, in Georgia, in Libya, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and he's always capitalized on them in a way that accrued positively towards Moscow. He's been a master. He may be the most evil master on the other side of the chessboard we've ever seen. I doubt that. There are quite a few that would rank with him. But he's always been pragmatic. He's always, in military terms, operated on interior lines, which means he's always got the advantage. This latest move, to me, looks like he may be reaching, and this is something to remember. He may be reaching that point in all tyrants' lives when they cross the border into infallibility. Some would say become megalomaniacal, but certainly think they can do anything without having repercussions that are serious for them and their state. That's kind of what this looks like, because the way he's conducting it, the invasion, if you will, although it is not being conducted like we're saying in our media it's being conducted, it's being conducted such as these kinds of operations can be, with great circumspection. To give you an example, he actually carved out a corridor, he didn't, his commanders did, out of Mariupol for the civilians to evacuate and to be unharmed. And one of the neo-Nazis in Mariupol, who was really in charge of the guns at that moment in Mariupol, had the mayor by the throat, literally, and said he would shoot the mayor and all the civilians he could shoot too if they started to leave him alone and his men alone in the city. So that's very frustrating for the Russian regimental commander, of course, that he can't let the citizens out. So, and they've left the fields alone, basically. They understand Ukraine is the breadbasket for 40% or more of the world, particularly Middle East and North Africa now. Lebanon gets about 50% of its grain products, barley, corn, wheat, from Ukraine. It's very essential. So he's left the fields alone. So this is not a bloody-minded invasion, if you will, in military terms. But nonetheless, the extent to which he's going, looking like he wants to secure Odessa even, and certainly keep the northern side of the Black Sea that's in Ukraine, is a little bit preposterous. So that's the second reality. And then the third reality, and this is brutal. This is truly brutal. And let me preface it by saying that what the Russians have done since 2012, 2013 in their field exercises, the Russian military, they have developed a doctrine and they've published it, and it's public. You can read it if you can read Russian. I don't think there are any translations. There may be a Finnish or a Norwegian translation, but I don't think there are any English translations yet. But you can read it if you read Russian. And it says that if there is an incursion into CSTO territory, that's the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is their equivalent of NATO. If there is an incursion, and you know they mean NATO, by NATO forces, then because of the extraordinary advantage NATO powers enjoy in precision-guided munitions, demonstrated in two wars the Russians have been able to watch, the first Iraq War and the second one, then they will blunt that penetration and hit on its flanks and its nose with nuclear weapons, with tactical nuclear weapons. So that leads me to my third reality about this crisis, and it is brutal, as I said. If 44 million Ukrainians have to be sacrificed on the altar of keeping 7 billion plus people on the globe from general nuclear war, then so be it. That's the reality of it. Ukraine is not worth the planet or the rest of the people, not in any way, fashion, or form. That leads me then to another fundamental about this crisis, and it is key. The only way to achieve a solution is diplomacy and politics. That is to say, political leaders have to get together and they have to exercise diplomacy no matter how difficult, and it's going to be difficult for Washington because we haven't done it for 21 years. Other than President Obama and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear agreement with Iran, we've not really done any sterling diplomacy in a long time. We've used bombs, bullets, and bayonets, the military, to force our way around in the world, which leads me back to that hypocrisy I talked about in the beginning. So how do you do that? Well, the first thing you have to do if you're Washington is you have to admit your own guilt. You don't have to tell the American people about it if you think it's domestically politically dangerous. It probably is, so you don't have to say that. But when you go into those negotiations, you have to go into the secret talks, as it were, and you have to admit that you are culpable to a certain extent, and you'll fix that culpability by guaranteeing Moscow Ukraine will never, never be a member of NATO. And you fix it otherwise by doing some things that probably would really, really bite in Washington, but you probably are going to have to do them. You're going to have to give Putin something to believe he's got some credit for what he's done, no matter how brutal we may think it is. Probably you're going to have to recognize his sovereignty over Crimea. And maybe you might exchange his recognition, because it's a done deal and he can't really do anything about it unless he's willing to go even deeper into war, for his recognition of Kosovo, which he has never recognized because he thought our operation in Kosovo was also a violation of international law and so forth. And he's right, it was. Bill Clinton just went off and did things, killed a lot of people when he went off and did things too. So some of those things are going to have to happen in this diplomacy. I go back to when Colin Powell in April of 2001 got into China's leadership quicker than Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, or George W. Bush, when we had a Chinese F-8 fighter plane run into our EP-3 Navy reconnaissance plane, killed the Chinese pilot. He crashed in the South China Sea. And our plane, with very, very high secrets on board and 24 people on board, went down in the heart of China's military complex on Hainan Island. And Powell took over immediately, and the crisis was solved, because in secret, what they really agreed to do was the Chinese were going to apologize in English and we were going to apologize in Chinese. Therefore, the only people who would hear our apology would be Chinese, and the only people who would hear their apology would be us. I mean, it wasn't that simple, but it was pretty much that simple. And it was all done in secret, and we avoided a real catastrophe there, more than you think, because Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld wanted war with China. And they wanted a Cold War with China at a minimum in order to increase the profits of the military industrial complex, which they were both heavily invested in. So that was a good moment, but it proved that most good diplomacy, really exquisite diplomacy, is done in secret. You don't tell everybody in the world, and you certainly don't tell the media. The last thing I would bring up in this is we have to stop this somewhere, because we have two huge crises confronting us. The one I've just touched upon is nuclear weapons. The United States has chosen, since my president, George W. Bush, abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty to destroy nuclear weapons arms control in the world. It's almost all gone now. The only thing that we have left is New START. This is extraordinarily dangerous. We were headed down from 30 weapons each, Moscow and Washington, for example, to about 1,200 each, which would have made a much safer world. We stopped now around 8,000 or 9,000 each, and we're going back to where we were before, developing new weapons and investing money in them. I'm waiting to see President Biden's nuclear posture review, because he promised in the campaign to take care of this to an extent. And now with Ukraine, I don't think he will. I think he'll be domestically prohibited. The Congress won't allow him to do it. So we'll go right on spending well over $1 trillion in the next 10 years to develop more of these weapons that threaten to wipe us all out. And then the second crisis is the climate crisis. And I'll just quote to you, as much as I can remember the words, they're close, but I'm paraphrasing a bit. The head of the Ukrainian delegation and the head of the Russian delegation to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that just released this report on 28 February. The Ukrainian said something to the extent of, "We are fools. We are fighting over the very things that will kill us all, fossil fuels." And she was right about that. That's a big motivation for this conflict. And the Russian brave man, I hope he's still living, he essentially condemned the invasion and said it was distracting from a far greater crisis. And he was absolutely right. We are all going to leave this planet in a very unfashionable way, like the dinosaurs did, by about mid-century or thereafter. Certainly by the beginning of the next century. My grandchildren might still be alive by that time. They certainly would be alive at mid-century, because we're going to probably reach 2.0 in temperature rise. And many scientists, and I deal with these scientists on a routine basis because I belong to the Climate Security Working Group here in Washington, say we're going to go to 3 or 4. Well, if you read that report closely that came out on 28 February, you'll see you do not want to live in a 2.0 centigrade degree increase world. You might not be able to live in a 3, and you certainly won't be able to live in a 4. That's what's confronting us. And if we don't do something about it and get out of this mindset where we have to fight each other and kill each other on the ground with bombs, bullets, and bayonets and airplanes and so forth, we're doomed. We're doomed as a species. That's my 15 minutes worth.
Thank you, Dr. Wilkerson. We'll have questions in a short while. Some hard truths, some things you may not have known or not wanted to hear, but there it is. And we'll take questions for Dr. Wilkerson in a few minutes. Our next speaker is Aaron Maté. Aaron Maté is an investigative Canadian journalist. He writes for Grayzone. He has his own podcast. He won the I.F. Stone Award for investigative journalists on Russiagate when he wrote for The Nation. He's written for the New Republic and many other outlets. And he's going to give us his perspective as an investigative journalist on the situation in Ukraine. Aaron Maté.
Thanks, Lee. Just one correction. I've never written for the New Republic.
Oh,
But aside from that, I appreciate the introduction and thank you for having me here. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak alongside Lawrence Wilkerson, who I always learn so much from and really admire. What's going on in Ukraine, as we all know, is a tragedy. And we all know that what Putin did is illegal and brutal. But I want to focus today on the aspects of this war that do not get the attention in the media, picking up on where Colonel Wilkerson left off, in which basically, in my view, looking at the relevant history, if we understand that this tragedy did not begin with the day that Vladimir Putin decided to invade, I think the record is pretty clear that Ukraine has essentially been used as a pawn in a US-led effort to weaken Russia and bleed Russia. And widening out the scope for a little bit beyond Ukraine, let's just go back to the end of the Cold War. What was the key promise that led Gorbachev to agree to reunify Germany? It was that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. We know now from the record that under Clinton, that pledge was violated, and NATO, a hostile military alliance, as we know from the experience of Yugoslavia and Libya, NATO expanded right up to Russia's borders. What happened in parallel with this? As Colonel Wilkerson mentioned, the US has been dismantling arms control treaties, posing a serious threat to Russia's security. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty was dismantled in 2003. The Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty was dismantled also under the Bush administration. When Donald Trump took office, one of his top aides was John Bolton, and Bolton picked up where he left off under Bush, dismantling the INF Treaty, which had eliminated an entire class of dangerous weapons, also dismantled the Open Skies Treaty, and they almost killed the New START Treaty, if not for a last-minute intervention by Joe Biden when he took office. So you have, for the last 20 years, a dismantling of the arms control treaties that keep the peace. And by the way, when the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty was dismantled, the official excuse from the Bush administration was that we needed to build new missile sites to protect Europe from Iran, which is a rationale I think that nobody takes seriously. It was obvious what the goal was. It was to further encircle Russia and threaten Russia. And the weapon systems have been built in Romania and Poland that can do just that. So you have the dismantling of arms control treaties. You also have the expansion of a hostile military alliance to Russia's borders. And the expansion of that hostile military alliance includes Ukraine, not realized yet, but certainly put in motion, beginning in 2008, when Ukraine and Georgia were promised membership in NATO. According to Fiona Hill, who was an aide to George W. Bush at the time, Bush was warned against doing this, but he ignored those concerns and supported a membership of Ukraine inside NATO. Fast forward to 2013, and now this is where I think the war in Ukraine really begins, not when Putin invades, but back in 2013 and 2014, when you have a US-backed coup. And that coup begins in the fall of 2013, when Carl Gershman, who was then the head of a group called the National Endowment for Democracy. It's funded by the US government and has long acted in parallel with US regime change and destabilization efforts around the world. And he declares in the Washington Post this, he writes, quote, "Ukraine is the biggest prize," unquote. And he says that if Ukraine can be pulled into the US-led Western orbit, then that will, quote, accelerate the demise of the ideology of Russian imperialism that Putin represents. Putin may find himself on the losing end, not just in the near abroad, but within Russia itself. So what was Carl Gershman saying there? He was basically saying that if Ukraine, historically tied to Russia, millions of ethnic Russians living there, 1/3 of the population speaks Russian. If Ukraine, a country on Russia's borders, can be pulled into the US-led orbit, where it is, in Gershman's words, the biggest prize, then that will redound to Russia as well and possibly see regime change, not just in Ukraine, but also in the Kremlin. And that's exactly what happened. A few months later, after Gershman wrote that, protests broke out, the Maidan protests of November 2013. Now, the spark for these protests was that a very corrupt president, Yanukovych, had rejected or backed out of a EU trade agreement that was presented to him. And tens of thousands of people who understandably were very upset with corruption in Ukraine and wanted to be part of the West took to the streets to protest. But at a certain point, these protests did not stay in concert with how they began, as being anti-corruption and pro-Western integration. At some point, these protests turned violent. And the violent element was led by, undeniably, a far-right fascist element that is, although small, a influential contingent inside Ukraine. And that far-right fascist element essentially spiked a compromise agreement that was reached, in which the President Yanukovych signed an agreement with the opposition in which he would agree to limited powers and hold new elections. So this is in February 2014. And when the far-right leaders who had by that point taken on a dominant role in the Maidan protest heard about this agreement, they reacted with outrage and they refused to accept it. And they reacted violently, leading to a series of events in which Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, was forced to flee. And around that time, the US essentially cheered Yanukovych's ouster. And it's pretty clear why, because shortly before Yanukovych fled, a conversation was leaked in which Victoria Nuland, who was then a senior Obama official and now is back under Biden, running Ukraine policy for Biden as well, was recorded speaking to the US ambassador to Ukraine at the time. And what they were essentially doing was selecting a new Ukrainian government that would come in. And the person that they settled on as prime minister is a guy named Yatsenyuk. Nuland is heard saying, Yats is the guy. And lo and behold, once Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, was ousted, it was Yatsenyuk who took over this new government. The new government was dominated in key cabinet positions by far-right officials, and that was understandable given the outsized role that the far-right played in the Maidan coup. And one of their first acts was to pass a law that essentially banned the Russian language. And Russians living in the East, or ethnic Russians living in the east of Ukraine, who had supported Yanukovych, understandably saw all this as an affront on them. And so they took up arms against the new coup government. One of the key inciting incidents in this, which does not get very much attention, was a massacre in Odessa in early May 2014, where dozens of ethnic Russians were burnt alive, protesting the Maidan coup. And people who were trying to even flee the building in which they were burning in were beaten. And so this led to a brutal war beginning, in which Russian-backed rebels in the East took up arms against the coup government. And that is a war that has been going on for the last 8 years. It's a war we're not allowed to acknowledge, I think primarily because the majority of the civilian victims, according to UN figures since 2018, have been on the Russian-speaking side. President Obama, after helping to trigger this proxy war by backing the Maidan coup, he was resistant to people inside Washington, including Joe Biden and Jake Sullivan, who wanted him to arm Ukraine even more for this fight. And he resisted heavy bipartisan pressure to do that. And one of his concerns was that he didn't want to further inflame a proxy war. He didn't want arms to get in the hands of neo-Nazis. And he also didn't want to give Ukraine the false impression that the US was willing to match the overwhelming military dominance that Russia had in an event of an all-out war. Obama did not see Ukraine as in the US strategic interest to basically risk World War III. Well, after Obama left office, Obama's caution was basically cast aside. And Trump, under heavy bipartisan pressure, he authorized the weapon sales that Obama would not send. When Trump briefly paused those weapon sales, he got impeached for it, although the allegation was that he had done so to pursue political objectives against Joe Biden. But the fact is, after Obama left, Washington, D.C., whether on the Democratic side or the Republican side, with the exception of Trump's brief pause on those weapons, coalesced around a strategy of essentially using Ukraine to fight Russia. In the words of Adam Schiff during Trump's impeachment, he said that the US aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here. So it shouldn't be no surprise then that Russia, in the face of an expanding hostile military alliance to its borders, in the face of a systemic US dismantling of arms control treaties, and the open admission from US officials across the spectrum that Ukraine is being used for a proxy war against Russia, it should be no surprise that Russia is now, in a very catastrophic and brutal way, is fighting back. And Biden had the opportunity when he came into office to avoid all this. Biden, when he came into office, was dealing with a new president, Zelensky, who was elected on an overwhelming mandate for peace. Zelensky promised in his inaugural address that he was going to take risks to end the war in the Donbass, to implement the Minsk Accords, which are the accords on record to resolve this crisis. They were reached in 2015. And the basic bargain is that the Donbass, where the Russian-backed rebels are, would demilitarize in exchange for having some autonomy. That autonomy would end the war and preserve Ukraine's borders as they currently stand, with the exception of Crimea. But that autonomy also would give the Russian-speaking rebels a veto over Ukraine joining NATO. And for that reason, I believe Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, with Washington's backing, has refused to implement them. There's been another major obstacle, though, to Minsk, and that is the far right inside Ukraine. Every time Zelensky has taken steps towards implementing Minsk via the Normandy format, which has been overseen by France and Germany, he's faced heavy protests from far-right elements inside of Ukraine, some of whom have even threatened to kill him. In the face of a far-right element inside Ukraine, which has a lot of power, there's, as we all know, the Azov Battalion is the only neo-Nazi militia in the world that is formally incorporated into a country's armed forces, and that's Ukraine's armed forces. Zelensky's faced threats from them every time he's signaled that he wants to implement peace. As one far-right leader put it, when Zelensky said that he was willing to take risks, political risks, to make peace with the Russian-backed rebels, this far-right leader, co-founder of the right sector, said that Zelensky would hang from a tree if he implements the Minsk Accords and makes peace with Russia. So in that climate, the only possible force that could act as a countervailing element to Ukraine's far right is Washington, which since the 2014 coup has had extreme leverage over Ukraine, and none more so than Joe Biden, who is the key official when it comes to Ukraine. And that's why the signal, a sign of that was the fact that Burisma, a Ukrainian energy company, felt compelled to give Hunter Biden, someone with no experience at all in the field, a lucrative energy company seat back in 2014, shortly after the coup. So Biden, if he had wanted to, could have, exerted U.S. muscle to tell the far right in Ukraine to go away, and that Minsk was going to be implemented and peace was going to happen. But Biden and his people have shown no willingness to do that. I think because implementing Minsk would essentially mean the end of Ukraine's NATO aspirations. So what has been the Biden policy? Well, a very illuminating window into what the Biden policy has been is what Zelensky did immediately after Biden took office. In early 2021, Zelensky banned the 3 main opposition television networks inside Ukraine, all of them tied to pro-Russian oligarchs. And according to Zelensky's top national security aide, speaking to Time magazine about a month ago, this banning of opposition television networks was conceived as, quote, a welcome gift to the Biden administration. So the signal from Biden from the start was that, the US was not interested in making peace with the Russian-speaking elements of Ukraine, was not interested in resolving the crisis. It was interested in escalation. And this has led to a series of events that have brought us to this moment, including the Biden administration deepening its military ties to Ukraine, and in November, signing an agreement that explicitly laid out membership as a goal and the Biden administration's support for preparing Ukraine for NATO membership. So all of this is the background to the moment that we're in now. Russia's invasion is a brutal response, an illegal response, but to pretend that it began with Russia's invasion ignores a long history that the US has played a critical role in. And without acknowledging that history, this crisis will not be resolved. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. We will take questions. We've heard two presentations of things that you may not have heard. My job here is, I actually have a PowerPoint. So my job here is I'm talking to you about media and why we know what we know. I think it will come up here in a second. Yes. Yes. I'm going to let that go to Dr. Wilkerson, who has much better understanding of the military side of this, and we'll do that in the question period. What I want to talk to you about is the media framing of this conflict, and I would argue that the more you watch, the less you know. You're not going to find anything about the war in the Ukraine by watching U.S. media or reading the U.S. newspapers. It's not going to happen, because what you just heard from Dr. Wilkerson and Aaron Maté is not what you're going to read or see on the American media. It's constructed in such a way that we only see certain aspects, and there's a reason for that. We have a theory in media studies, it's called media framing. And we understand media framing has four particular functions: to define an event, to diagnose its causes, to evaluate the people that are participating in that event, and then prescribe the preferred actions. That happens using certain techniques, and the techniques that are used to make the framing of the Ukraine crisis clear to the American people are very clear when you take time to step back and look at how this conflict has been framed. There are four primary ways that it's framed. The first is by selecting particular sources. Which sources are selected? Obviously, you know this from your own personal life. If you're going to ask somebody that's a favorite superhero fan if they like the last superhero movie, you're probably going to get a yes. If you're going to ask somebody that doesn't like them, you're probably going to get a no. Depending on your source is going to really determine how the news will be framed. The second is, even after you select the sources, the media goes out of its way to identify and evaluate those sources, either saying that they're preferred or positive or negative. In this conflict, as in almost all war and military conflicts, there's a heavy emphasis on the military details. There's a heavy emphasis on the technology, and to some lesser extent, there's an emphasis or opportunity for civilians to speak, which is amazing in this particular case. And the final thing, the most important thing, which Aaron spoke to a lot, and Dr. Wilkerson also alluded to several times, is the lack of any historical context. You can't understand this conflict if you don't know what happened last week, last month, 10 years ago. It's just not possible. So what are the sources that are primary here? US and NATO are the primary sources. And unlike in most previous wars that the US has been involved in, there's a large number of sources from Ukrainian citizens. This is unusual, but I think that there's a reason for that. I just have a comparison here. This is the Ukraine the first 3 weeks on the three major TV networks. Fox isn't there. 240 sources, 119, almost half, are Ukrainian citizens. Compare that to the first 3 weeks of the Iraq war when the US started shock and awe. 8% of the sources were Iraqi. Why would that be? Because the US did not want American people to hear what the Iraqis were responding to the US invasion. That would not fit the narrative that the US is there for humanitarian reasons. On the other hand, in the case of this, with the Ukrainians, we get daily stories of citizens being attacked or citizens fleeing or civilians being crushed or school being bombed or something. That, in my opinion, is weaponizing empathy for the Ukrainian citizens. And I'm not going to make a big deal out of it, but it's It's CBS, NBC, most of them have pointed out that should not happen because these are blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white, European Christians, just like us. Not like those Iraqis or Syrians or Yemenis that are used to war. These are nice people that could be your neighbor. And that's who you should have sympathy for. They look just like some of you. To go along with that is there's descriptions so that it's clear who you're supposed to support. So the civilian heroes like Zelensky, which Aaron just talked about, is presented as a civilian hero. You see pictures of 8-year-olds learning to use weapons, of grandmothers being trained in weapon use, of the grandmother throwing the seeds at the Russian. You get these things that present to you, these are good people fighting for liberty and freedom against the very negative descriptions, viable, obviously, of the Russian invasion. Dr. Wilkerson alluded to it, Aaron alluded to it, but to say that this is unprovoked, if you just heard both of them, that is absolutely not true. To say it's justified, no. To say it's unprovoked, no. Those are not the same thing. Then there's a focus on details. In almost every day of the New York Times, they'll show you a picture and they'll show you where a bombing has happened and where civilians have been killed. Sometimes they'll give you lists and compare the military, which shows how powerful and resistant the Ukrainians are, because look at all the tanks that Russia has and they can't do anything. Here's the biggest thing. There is no historical context to this. You would not know if you read the American press that Russia is a capitalist country. Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia is a capitalist country with major US and EU investment. You will not know, as Aaron explained it, so I don't have to go through it, the US support of the Maidan Revolt, or the Minsk Agreement that promised autonomy to the Donbass, or the attacks on the culture and the language in the Donbass, or the provocations, including by neo-Nazis. There is a competition for markets. Who's going to get rich off of this war? Not the Ukrainians. There's sympathy for the Ukrainians doesn't go so far as ending the war. Instead, you're going to give them more weapons so they can die more, so that more weapons can be sold for Raytheon, Lockheed, General Dynamics, billions of dollars. The US has already authorized $350 billion to the Ukraine, and Biden is on the verge of sending another $800 billion. That doesn't go to your pocket, that goes to the military producers. And it skews the sanctions even. Something may have changed in the last week, but Gazprom and Rosneft, EU does not sanction them because the EU has major investment from BP, Shell, Total. It wasn't until recently that Biden even included them, because originally they weren't even on, because there's important geopolitical and corporate interests, so that some sanctions are publicized and the sanctions that aren't being distributed are just ignored. And who suffers? The Ukrainians. The Ukrainians. Again, I'm not going to go through all this, but if you want to find out what Aaron said about the promise about not expanding NATO, you can go to the George Washington University National Security Archive and you can read it. You can read what Bush and James Baker said. You can read and you can see, this is a picture from Der Spiegel, which is a German thing, of how NATO has expanded since 1999. NATO bombed Yugoslavia for 78 days. And most of you probably weren't alive enough to read the newspapers or watch TV, but maybe those of you that were could try to remember, were there pictures of civilians being killed and sympathy for the civilians and calls to, yeah, it was a different story. Likewise, again, I'm not going to go through the NED, the International Republican Institute, and the things that Aaron already shared with us, but that is off the table. Likewise, the role of the neo-Nazis in the government. This is not a Nazi government. This is not a fascist government, but there are neo-Nazis that are incorporated into the military. And they are the ones that are primarily responsible for the civil war in the eastern part of, sometimes it breaks through the media even. This is from MSNBC, and this is someone training a heroic civilian. Whoever was MSNBC didn't have enough sense to block this out. This is Wolf's Angel. It's a Nazi symbol. These are the people that are training and fighting for on behalf of Ukrainian freedom. Again, it's not always good to make comparisons, but the UN says 14,000 people were killed in the Donbass in the last 7 years. The UN says as of date, about 1,000 civilians have been killed in the Ukraine in the last 4 weeks. There's probably many more, but these are the ones that they have actually documented and can confirm. 14,000 killed. And when did you hear about those 14,000 people being killed? By arms that were supplied by the United States to the Azov battalion? I would submit that you probably did not, but you can't avoid hearing about what's happening now. Another list, if we're going to make some comparisons, 4 weeks of Russian airstrikes, there's been repeated airstrikes by Israel and Syria since 2013. Saudi Arabia has killed 400,000 people in Yemen with assistance from the United States. And there aren't crocodile tears shed for them. Their lives are absolutely worth the same as the lives in any other country. Or, and you don't know this, it's secret, but the United States has had 32 drone attacks in Somalia, which is a country the US is not at war at, and how many civilians were killed? We don't know. So here's the summary. Selected sources, selected events, descriptions that frame the legitimacy of the participants, emphasis on battle and individuals, and the historical context is hidden or distorted, which means the prescribed solution, and you can read this in most editorial pages of most newspapers by commentators that have never seen a weapon and aren't going to war, that favor the no-fly zone and increased militarization. In fact, 32 nations are sending arms to the Ukraine. What that means is the Ukrainian citizens are being sacrificed. That's what that means. No consideration for ending the war. In fact, if you suggest a ceasefire or negotiation, you're accused of being unpatriotic or soft on Putin. I ask you to consider this just as a thought exercise. What if Russia had supported groups in Canada or Mexico for the last 10 years? What if Russia had bases built in Ontario, Havana, or Tijuana with missiles pointed at the US? What if Russia put thousands of troops in Cuba with missiles? What would be the US response? What would be your reaction? And I ask you, what would have happened if the media, which didn't, report the US NATO aggression in Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Somalia? What if the media showed the same kind of sympathy for civilian deaths in Yemen that they've shown for the Ukraine? What would your response be? You'd all be flying Yemeni flags right up there next to the Ukrainian flags. But they're not going to tell you because Saudi Arabia provides oil to the United States. Somebody's getting rich and they're selling arms to Saudi Arabia. Somebody's getting rich and it's none of your business because they aren't people that look like most of you. So my conclusion is pretty much what the other two speakers said. Russia out of Ukraine, ceasefire now, no to a no-fly zone, US out of Ukraine, US out of Europe, and abolish NATO. In other words, everybody's hands off Ukraine. Now we can have questions, and we can start with the one that had Dr. Wilkerson's up and Aaron's up. So hopefully you can hear. We have a microphone. Don't we have a mic? Yeah, we have an extra microphone. Here, take mine.
Is it true that Russia is taking a look at its core problems?
Okay, I'm just seeing the chat. No, so we cannot hear the live mic, or at least I can't hear the live mic.
Nor can I.
Yeah.
No, no one can.
Yeah, so if you're speaking to us, we cannot hear you. How about I ask Larry a question? Larry, how do you see this ending? What is it? What is an off ramp that you think all the major players involved can live with? Russia, Ukraine, Washington.
I think there are two aspects of an answer to that, or at least I think I've discovered them in a lot of conversations with people here lately who know this a lot better than I. One is, as I suggested in my preliminary remarks, is that we sit down and do some serious talking. I am hearing right now that we are embarked on that, maybe. I don't know who's involved. If it's Blinken and Sullivan, forget it. There's got to be somebody like Bill Burns or somebody like that who's really a good diplomat. And I know he's director of the CIA, but he's also an excellent diplomat. You've got to talk, and you got to be willing to give more than Putin has to give. At this point, we've got to be able to give things. As I said, recognition of sovereignty over Crimea. Most vividly, we've got to say no more NATO expansion, period. No more NATO expansion. It's become untenable. 30 nations, and the West Texas rancher who thinks he's knows where Montenegro is and that he's going to risk nuclear war over Montenegro. He isn't going to do that, nor is anybody from hinterland in general. The second aspect of it is once you get that, if you can, and you pointed out why you probably can't, because there's so many special interests just reaping profits here. But once you get that, I think Fyodor Lubanov, a Russian journalist, had a great suggestion the other day, and Tom Graham was on with him, and I thought they would probably conflict, and Graham, I think, was agreeing with him. Graham, of course, being a National Security Council member, know Tom pretty well. We need a new Helsinki Final Act, Paris Accord, call it what you will. And then we need to set up a new architecture for transatlantic security. And I don't mean that so narrowly as I'm saying it, because what I would do is three fundamentals. Washington gives up its desire for hegemony over Western Europe. Moscow gives up its desire to reestablish Soviet hegemony over Eastern Europe. And Europe stands up. 740 million strong now with 140 million Russians and a GDP equivalent to ours. It's about time you get your act together. Go tell London, go to hell. If you got a Brexit, that's sorry. You can be out there across the channel in the ocean. But the rest of us are getting together, economically, politically, socially, culturally, you name it. And we're going to provide our own security architecture. And guess what? Russia's going to be a part of it because Russia's a part of Europe. And then let's deal with the real threats in the world, as you pointed out, nuclear weapons and the climate crisis. Now, something I found out yesterday, of all people, a Vatican member told me, because he'd just come back from China with regard to trying to get the Chinese to, relax a little on their treatment of Catholics. The Chinese have over $3 billion invested in Ukraine to develop it into an entrepot for their base road initiative flow into Europe. So they're not too happy about this, despite what the media is saying, because that's a heck of an investment for them when they've spread this money, $1 trillion or more, all over the place. They got quite a bit in Ukraine.
Another question that came in, and this is your area, Colonel Wilkerson, is Russia experiencing logistical problems right now?
Yes, they've never had a terrific logistic capability. They don't have NCOs, for one thing. So it's officer to conscript or officer to professional down at the lower level. And that's why you see officers getting killed at a much greater rate than in our military. Although I said the other day, I kind of feel good if a US general got killed every now and then because they don't ever go to the front lines. Omar Bradley was 300 miles in the rear when the Battle of the Bulge started. That's American way of war. But because of that, they run out of fuel, they run out of food, they ravage and pillage the countryside, which they haven't done yet. And I think it's because they know how important those fields are. And that's their policy, is not to disturb the fields, the growing, and then the harvest. So, but they're not good at logistics, and they're not good at leadership at the lower level. They just aren't. And Powell lectured them on that in Vienna and Warsaw as we were trying to establish a more cooperative relationship and trying to teach them how to make a more professional armed force, how to honor something like a constitution. Powell even told them that, hey, I serve a constitution that doesn't like me. My founding fathers didn't like a standing military. And you need to get used to that if you're going to be a democracy. And, these were incredible lectures. I mean, they were euphoric times. We thought Russia was going to be ultimately a partner, maybe even initially an observer at the political and the military alliance, and then probably later on a member, which would have been sort of this transformation I'm talking about, where the security architecture would be completely revised and Europe would be its own power. There are three centers of power in the world today, and China's not one of them, really. It's America, it's Europe, and it's everybody else, including China. And I think you got to throw other people in. You got to throw India in there, for example, even though Modi's killing all his Muslims now, which is not a good development. But when you throw all these other people in there, there are really three centers, but those centers need to cooperate. I gave a talk to a group in Tokyo. It was midnight here. It was a good time for them there the other day. And I said, we need a policy of cooperation, collaboration, and comity. The Japanese love the term comity because they translated it as harmony. And that's what we need. And yet we are so far from that right now. It's pitiful. And yet if we don't get it, we aren't going to meet either of these two huge challenges.
Lee, if you're there, are there any more questions from the audience? Okay, if Lee is there, I still can't. Okay, here we go. There's another question coming in. You're waiting for the question. Okay, I'm just reading the chat here, everybody. So maybe I'll ask Colonel Wilkerson another question as we wait for the audience question.
Let me ask you one.
Sure.
I thought, by the way, I thought your articulation of how this all got started and the depth of the history such as you could do in that short period of time was quite good. I think we are at a time now where the CIA is using the IRI, the NED, and a host of other. I even had a talk with the vice president of World Vision about infiltration. So now we are using an entirely different technique to get these color revolutions going. And that technique is to use these NGOs and Quahogs and others. Yeah, and I don't know if they're aware of it or not. I think probably not. I saw it really badly in Caracas. That's kind of how it got started, both with Hugo Chavez and then later with Nicolas Maduro. This is not a good development. What do you
No,
think?
and look, I mentioned before Victoria Nuland, who was Dick Cheney's former chief of staff, right? That's how she got her start that was her first senior role as an aide to Dick Cheney. And then she went on to work for Obama. And when she was caught on that phone call plotting to who would be the next Ukrainian government, that came after she had publicly disclosed that the US spent $5 billion on democracy promotion inside Ukraine since the end of the Cold War. And when you're spending $5 billion on democracy promotion, what does that really mean in practice? It means funneling money to groups that you can use to destabilize the government that you want to overthrow. That's essentially how these funds have been used. I mean, not all of it, I'm sure, but that's a major component of it. And in Ukraine, there was some of that in 2004 with the color revolution there, but it really hit its peak in 2014 with the coup, where television networks and organizations that played a role in fomenting unrest had received US money. And it's the playbook, yes, that they have pursued everywhere. And it's very smart because it's a way to achieve your geopolitical goals without sending in troops and tanks, and doing it in a more covert manner. And I think the US has been very effective at that. And I think Ukraine has been a very good example of it.
My problem with it, I think a significant problem, is that what I see, if it's accurate, is a lot of people dying on the other end of the stick, if you will. Yes, we don't. But look at Venezuela, for example, or look at Colombia as it was affected by Venezuela, or look at Georgia, or look at almost anywhere in Middle East, North Africa, the Levant. It just doesn't seem to work very well for them.
Okay, another question that has come in. Colonel Wilkerson, any comments on India's stance so far and Pakistan? Interesting that the US claims that the entire world is on their side, but countries like India and Brazil, even the Saudi Arabia and the UAE, traditional US allies, have been more neutral when it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, I think Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other oil producers, other than perhaps Venezuela, with whom I think we're in some significant negotiations right now to revive their oil industry. It's a mixed bag. Saudi Arabia, for years, the Saudis, and I had a conversation when I was chief of staff of the State Department with their deputy oil minister, who essentially told me this: we don't ever want to incentivize renewables. And so we know the price has to stay at that time, between about $78 and $88 a barrel. It has to, because otherwise we'll make more money, yes, in the short term, but we'll incentivize renewables and we'll be stranded assets out to, we'll have $30 trillion in stranded assets, oil we can't burn. Now they see the handwriting on the wall, especially with this last IPCC report. They see it. They want to get all that out of the ground and spend it. They want it gone, and they want it at the highest price they can get. They don't care about the range anymore. If it's $100, $200, $300 a barrel, yeah, that's fine. That's even better. So that's part of their motivation. As part of their motivations, they're paying us back for threatening. We even passed legislation, you'll recall, in both houses to stop supporting them in their brutal war in Yemen. And so they're getting back at us for that. You'll notice we just shipped Patriot batteries back over there in an effort to teach him BS that we can still help him and so forth, and get his blessings again. And of course, the death of Khashoggi didn't do any good, especially with key members of the Senate who weren't too happy about that. And India gets 60% of its principal armaments from Russia. So it's got to be very, very careful about how it treats its relationship with Russia. We did our best to wean, the US military and the government, to wean India off Russian equipment. And it became clear to them that the logistics package that has to come with this very sophisticated equipment, like the airplanes and so forth, is so expensive, and the changeover to US, which would be more expensive, was too big. So they decided to stay with Russia, and that's where they are. They got a real eye opener when they almost went to war here recently, and the Pakistani Air Force really ripped the Indian Air Force up because they were in F-16s. And all of a sudden the Indian Air Force became, a thorn in the side of the civilian government, saying this Russian equipment got beat by those US provided F-16s. Well, it just so happens the F-16 is probably the finest aircraft ever made by man, something we haven't done since. But nonetheless, it did teach at least the Indian Air Force that, hey, the Russian equipment might not be quite as good as you think it is, and you could have had the US equipment. But who knows where that's going. And Modi and Biden, I don't think on a human rights basis have had a great relationship, not to this point. I'll give Biden that. For his people talking about that sometimes.
Can either of you hear me now?
Yes.
I can hear you. Yep.
Okay, good. We have technical problems with the microphone, so I'm just going to stay at the laptop. But there's a question earlier was, what's the essential difference between Ukrainians and Russians? And how have they developed since Kievan Rus? That's a historical question. Differences between Ukrainians and Russians.
What's the difference between Catherine the Great and Russians? She was born in Poland.
She was born in Germany. It wasn't Poland then.
Okay. But she's considered a member of the Polish royalty.
No, she's not. No, absolutely not. But what is the
I guess
answer
the
to that?
Encyclopedia Britannica is wrong then.
Yeah, look, are you asking a question that you know the answer to? Do you want to share your answer?
I'm asking a question to see how well you know the subject matter, because your presentations aren't focused on Ukraine. Your presentations are focused on American foreign policy, and it seems like Ukraine is not the subject.
No, I want him to stop talking. I don't want anybody to be able to talk.
Okay. Well,
Should ask questions, because otherwise it gets totally.
Could you answer the question, because people need to hear the answers?
okay. Well, I'm focused on the US because that's the government that I pay taxes to, and I think has played a critical role in this conflict. That's what I'm focused on. And the point of my contribution here is to say that Ukraine has been used as a pawn in a broader struggle between the US and Russia. And I think that's led to great harm to Ukraine, as we're seeing now. That's the point I make. In terms of your question about the difference, does it not have to do with basically how the borders of Ukraine were drawn? And you have people who identify who are ethnic Russian and people who come in the West from Poland.
Yeah, there's another question that's been submitted, which is, again, it's not on Ukraine. This one's on Yemen. I think you can read this. Opinions on the situation in Yemen, not being covered that much from the media. And you might want to address this larger question, which is a question that Dr. Janusz is asking, which is, is it legitimate to talk about things other than Ukraine when you want to talk about Ukraine? It's kind of the whataboutism charge that's been made when people say, well, yeah, but what about this or what about that? Is that a legitimate response? Which I think is the substance of his question. So,
You want to take it, Aaron? I don't think you can possibly judge a great power without looking at the great power's actions in other areas. And you can't judge the United States in the present context, or Russia, or anyone else, really, even down to Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and so forth, without looking at what they're doing, because they are, whether we like it or not, our allies. And if they are doing the kinds of things that are happening in Yemen right now, and I would bring up Israel too, and the Palestinians, Gideon Levy from Haaretz said the other day, we were all talking about, the ethnic cleansing or whatever you want to call it, the Russians are doing in Ukraine. Look at what the Israelis have been doing to the Palestinians for years now. It's like the American West, a settlement and the treaties violated and get off my land. It's like we did 150, 160 years ago. Only it is 150, 160 years later now. And we've had the Geneva Conventions and we've had international humanitarian law and so forth. It's not really what nations should be doing, and yet they're still doing it. So to not reference those things when you're talking about the quality of the foreign and security policy of a great power is nonsense.
We have another question over here. You go ahead and say it as loud as you can, so Marco can hear it.
You'll have to repeat that. It's very hard to hear. If what is being said is directed to us, we can't make it out.
you've got to speak up because I'm going to type it so they can hear it. But I can't hear you and I'm in the same room.
You can go ahead and maybe address it.
All you got to do is speak loud. Use your outdoor voice.
So I wanted to know from a media standpoint,
Yes.
I wanted to know my findings from journalist Laura Logan. She's an award-winning journalist. She states that America has so many vital labs within the Russian itself, and also we're not knowing about the biolabs. We were lied to about the public health labs for COVID-19, the Russian collusion, and the Nazis' emblem, as you showed with the soldiers,
So
with their image. So I want to know how long have we been lied to, and how can we change that? How can we resolve?
I think I got the question. What is the significance of Victoria Nuland recently? So she was in front of the Senate and she was asked by Marco Rubio, does Ukraine have chemical or biological weapons?
My second part to that question is,
She didn't give a direct answer. And instead, she
they
said
think
that she's just concerned with,
NATO was ran by neo-Nazis.
okay. So yeah, I was just trying to summarize the question. And Nuland said that she didn't give a direct answer to Rubio's question. Instead, she said that she's concerned that Ukraine's biological facilities could fall into Russia's hands. Russia has then made a series of allegations that the U.S. does have weaponized biolabs inside Ukraine. And so, yeah, for me, I have no insight into this topic. I'd love to hear what Colonel Wilkerson has to say. Such serious allegations require evidence, and I personally haven't seen the evidence yet on the Russian side to substantiate it. But I did think that Nuland's evasive answer was interesting.
Do you think that Russia would not intervene in Eastern Europe states if NATO did not exist?
There's a couple more questions on chat. I think that you can probably see them. You want to respond to either of those?
Okay, well, I just summarized the question about the biolabs. If Colonel Wilkerson has anything to say about that.
I had occasion to read a line in the New York Times that really sort of angered me. The moment that report first came out, the Times ran an article that had a line in it that went almost, I can almost do it verbatim. The allegations that there are biological laboratories in Ukraine are baseless. Well, the New York Times had to come out with a correction the very next day, but of course they buried the correction. There are labs in Ukraine, and it is my understanding and everything I've been able to find out, and I'm like you, Aaron, I'm not an expert on this. I don't know that this is true. There are WHO, there are US, there are global health authorities interested in developing ways to fight pandemics and disease outbreaks like Ebola Zaire. And that's what they're doing. Now, what else they're doing, I have no idea. I suspect probably few people do other than the people actually in the labs.
Would Russia intervene and interfere in Eastern Europe if NATO did not exist? Well, that reminds me of a great saying from Richard Sakwa, who's a scholar who wrote a book called Frontline Ukraine, which I thought was very informative. And he says that essentially NATO exists to manage the risks created by its existence. I thought that was a very sharp line.
Yes. Yes.
Would you repeat that? That was too terse. Say that again, Aaron.
Richard Sakwa says NATO exists to manage the risks created by its existence.
Colin Powell once told me a story about when he was an advisor in Vietnam in 1963, I believe it was, and he was sitting beside a runway in the middle of the jungle with his Vietnamese counterpart, who was a Vietnamese equivalent lieutenant colonel. And he asked the guy why that runway was there in the first place. And the Vietnamese officer said, well, it's there to resupply the tower by the runway. And he said, well, why is the tower there? And the guy said, well, the tower's there to protect the runway and to supervise the planes landing. That's why it was there. There was no strategic or tactical reason at all for it to be there. And so they spent their time doing nothing but, going back and forth. That's a good summation of NATO now, I think.
Another question?
Yeah.
There's another one. The question is, how would NATO being dismantled benefit anyone?
Well,
He said, Dr. Artz concluded his presentation with this, and what are your thoughts?
I think the more important organization is the European Union rather than NATO. And if the European Union in its $1 trillion, equivalent to our GDP and so forth, if it wanted to have a security implement, a security apparatus, we've been working on this for years and supposedly Washington's been in favor of it, but I've been in the government. Pardon me. We weren't very much in favor of it. Every time the European security identity, as we called it at that time, threatened to stand up and put its own brigades in the field, armed and ready to go, we found some reason to object to it because it would detract from NATO's military. And after all, they didn't have very big military, so that detracting would be significant from NATO. But that's what Europe should do, develop its own capability to defend itself. And it should be just that, defense, not offense.
On the point about offense, I would ask the inverse question. How did NATO's existence benefit Libya? It left Libya in ruins, and now we have slavery returned to Libya. So I don't think you can say that NATO was a benefit to Libya. It was a threat. And I thought the point of NATO, when it was established, was to defend the world from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is no more. And since then, even when Russia, including Putin, if I understand history correctly, expressed interest in joining NATO, he was essentially laughed away because NATO now exists to basically, as Richard Sakwa says, confront enemies that it creates and threats that it creates. And so how can that dynamic benefit anyone, except for weapons manufacturers in Washington, who, by the way, have spent a lot of money lobbying for NATO expansion?
Yes.
If you go back and read the New York Times in the late 90s when NATO was being expanded, weapons manufacturers were spending record amounts of money lobbying the Senate to expand NATO. The head of a group called the Committee to Expand NATO, which was the chief lobby group promoting NATO expansion in the late 1990s. Maybe you know him, Colonel Wilkerson. His name is Bruce Jackson.
Right.
And by day, Bruce Jackson's day job was the vice president of Lockheed Martin.
Right.
So that's who benefits from expanding NATO is Lockheed Martin. And anybody else, I don't think you can say it's to our benefit.
We had a saying in the old days in the military, NATO's purpose was to keep Germany down, Russia out, and the US in. That summed up NATO. That no longer works.
I'm sure you have
Look at
more.
the impact on Germany, and look at the impact on Germany now. Just yesterday, the chancellor warned that his country and Europe will fall into a deep recession if the embargo on Russian energy continues. This is putting Germany in a terrible position. They've had to cancel the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which would have brought energy, Russian energy to them faster, and it's going to raise energy prices. So how does this benefit? How does this benefit them? It speaks to what Colonel Wilkerson has been saying, that it's time for Europe to take care of its own security, and instead of treating Russia as this continued enemy, why not work together? Why not share your resources? Why stay in this perpetual state of conflict? Doesn't make sense to me.
I want to thank Dr. Wilkerson and Aaron Maté for joining us. Maybe we can show some appreciation here. The beauty of the internet is that it doesn't always work all the time, but the internet, you can find Aaron Maté and Dr. Larry Wilkerson on the internet, I'm sure. And if you wanted to ask them further questions, you could do that. And you know where to find me, over in the communication department. So I want to thank you all for coming. A big thanks to both Dr. Wilkerson and Aaron Maté for sharing their thoughts with us. It gives us all something to think about. And I want to recognize Dr. Kim Sipes. He came in late. He's part of the Center for Global Studies as well. So thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank
Thank you, Larry and Aaron. Thanks. Well done,
Thanks a lot.
gentlemen.
Thanks
Thanks.
for having us. Thank you.
Thank you
Yeah.
for being with us.
Always have to be able to adjust when technology doesn't work, right?
That's true. Unless we got some mic somewhere.
Yeah. Well, it was okay. I didn't have to walk around with them. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.